Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will offer an update on the case of Sherri Papini. She is the topic of a documentary titled Sherri Papini, Caught in the Lie. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, a summary of the documentary, then offer my analysis. Sherri Louise Papini was born on June 11, 1982, and lived in Redding, California. When she was 16 years old, she ran away from home. At some point, she must have returned because in 2000, her father contacted the police and said that Sherri burglarized his residence. In September 2003, he accused her of making unauthorized withdrawals from his bank account. 3 months later, Sherri's mother accused her of attempting to harm herself and trying to blame the injuries on her. Sherri married a man named David Dreyfus in 2006. They divorced 2 years later. In October 2009, she married a man named Keith Papini. They would go on to have 2 children. Sherri and Keith lived in the Mountain Gate area of Shasta County, near Redding, California. Their home was in a rural area. As early as December 2015, Sherri Papini started having conversations with a former boyfriend named James Reyes. They used prepaid cell phones to conceal their affair. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On November 2, 2016, Sherri's husband Keith contacted the police at 5:50 p.m. saying that he could not find her. He found her phone about a mile from the family home. It was on the ground. Her earbuds, which had strands of hair on them, were coiled up on top of the phone. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. A witness had seen Sherri running on Sunrise Drive between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. Sherri's financial accounts had not been accessed. Her purse and jewelry were accounted for. Law enforcement expended significant resources trying to find Sherri, but they did not have any success. On November 24, 2016, 22 days after Sherri went missing, the California Highway Patrol responded to several 911 calls at about 4:30 a.m., reporting that a woman was standing or running on Interstate 5. The police arrived at the scene and found Sherri Papini. She had a chain around her waist, which was connected to one of her arms. Her other wrist and both her ankles had makeshift restraints on them. She was transported to Woodland Hospital, where several injuries were observed. For example, a brand on her back near her right shoulder, bruises, rashes, burns, and a swollen nose. Here is the story that Sherri supplied to the police. On November 2, 2016, as she was jogging, a dark-colored SUV drove past her, stopped, then backed up. A woman in the passenger seat requested assistance. As Sherri approached the vehicle, she noticed the woman was holding a revolver. The woman said something to the effect of, "We don't want to hurt you." Sherri put her phone and earbuds on the ground. She did not remember getting into the vehicle or how long she was there. She woke up in a room with zip ties around her wrists and realized there were 2 kidnappers, both Hispanic women. Sherri helped the FBI to create sketches of these 2 mysterious women. Over the next few weeks, the kidnappers caused all the injuries which had been observed on Sherri. On November 24, 2016, one of the kidnappers drove Sherri to where she was found on Interstate 5 and told her to exit the vehicle. The police had serious doubts regarding Sherri's story. Kidnappings of an adult perpetrated by women are extremely rare. Even so, they could not disprove her story. Just 4 days after she was found, Sherri applied to the California Victim Compensation Board. She eventually received about 35 payments, totaling over $30,000. She used much of this for mental health counseling over the next few years. The police found male DNA on Sherri's underwear, which was unexpected because Sherri never mentioned coming in contact with a man. It took investigators until 2020 to identify the source of the DNA. It was from Sherri's former boyfriend, James Reyes, who lived in a house in Costa Mesa, California. This is 583 miles south of Redding. The police paid James a visit on August 10, 2020. He initially lied to them, but eventually admitted that he had been with Sherri during the 22 days that she was missing. She stayed in his house the entire time, never leaving even once. Sherri told James that her husband had mistreated her and she wanted to escape him. During Sherri's stay, she caused injuries to herself and asked James to brand her, which he did using a wood-burning tool. Eventually, Sherri said she missed her children and wanted to leave. James took her back to Northern California. The FBI interviewed Sherri on August 13, 2020, 3 days later. They informed her that lying to a federal officer is a crime. After they accused her of fabricating her story, Sherri denied it. She maintained that she had been telling the truth. On March 3, 2022, Sherri Papini was arrested and charged with making false statements to a federal law enforcement officer and 34 counts of mail fraud. On April 18, 2022, Sherri pleaded guilty to 1 count of making false statements and 1 count of mail fraud. She was later sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay over $300,000. In November 2022, Sherri reported to prison. Her husband Keith filed for divorce, and Sherri lost custody of her children. In August 2023, Sherri Papini was released from prison and moved in with her parents. Now moving to a summary of the documentary, Sherri Papini, Caught in the Lie. The documentary covered the basics of Sherri's story. She went missing, then showed up 22 days later with a bizarre kidnapping story. Sherri viewed the documentary as her opportunity to tell the truth, at least according to her. She participated in several interviews and even a reenactment of the alleged kidnapping. Sherri offered a new story about what happened to her. It's worth noting that her story involves accusations against both James and Keith, which the men have denied. Here is Sherri's new version of events. Sherri dated James back in 2003, but there was no alignment in their sexual desires. She left him and married Keith. Sherri did not mention her first husband, David, in the documentary. The marriage to Keith was unhappy. Sherri was dying inside. Keith caught her texting another man and asked her to sign a post-nuptial agreement, which would give him everything if they divorced. Despite signing the agreement, Sherri started an emotional affair with James. This happened right before she lost her job. Sherri stayed at home, and Keith controlled various aspects of her life. For example, he controlled their money and would not allow her to talk to him at night. She felt like a ghost. Despite her unhappy marriage, Sherri wanted to terminate her affair with James. He was supposed to come to Redding, California, to say goodbye. On November 2, 2016, when Sherri was jogging near her home, James pulled up in a vehicle. Her cell phone fell to the ground. The last thing Sherri remembered was reaching down to get her phone. She woke up briefly in the vehicle. The next time she woke up, she was chained up in a bedroom in the house occupied by James. He told her he was keeping her safe and that he had people watching her when he was at work. James inflicted injuries upon Sherri, but she's not exactly sure what happened because she had more memory problems. He told her that he was harming her for sexual gratification. Eventually, Sherri agreed to fabricate the story about the women kidnapping her in order to convince James to release her. After he returned her to Northern California, Sherri concealed the identity of her attacker. She lied because she was in danger. James said that he would be watching her. Also, Sherri did not want her husband Keith to find out about the affair because she would lose everything due to the post-nuptial agreement. Despite her intent to keep James out of her narrative, she did leave a clue to his identity. She claimed that the mother of James was Hispanic, therefore blaming Hispanic women connected to him. In reality, his mother was Irish. Essentially, the argument that Sherri made in the documentary was that she only lied about the identity of James. She claimed the remainder of her story was true. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. The primary question explored in the Sherri Papini documentary is whether Sherri was lying when she accused James of kidnapping her. In my opinion, Sherri perpetrated a hoax. James did not kidnap her. Here are a few of the factors that support this theory. A cousin of James observed Sherri at the house where James lived on 2 occasions during the time that Sherri was missing. The story that James provided matched the data from the burner phones and rental car records. Sherri was caught in a lie about how her phone ended up on the ground. Sherri maintained that she was somehow rendered unconscious right after James interrupted her run. How would that be possible? It is pretty difficult to render a person unconscious instantly. Sherri had inexplicable memory loss for that event and for other times during her ordeal. Sherri signed a plea agreement with the federal government taking responsibility for her crimes. This agreement contains an exhibit which explains the factual basis for the plea. The exhibit states that Sherri admitted to knowingly planning and participating in a hoax kidnapping. She told James where to meet her in Redding, California, so he could pick her up, and she voluntarily entered the rental car that James was driving. Sherri spent a lot of time in the documentary offering explanations for these various inculpatory factors. This is really what the documentary was about. Sherri wanted to convince people that her unlikely story was actually the truth. Item number 2. In the documentary, Sherri's psychotherapist commented on Sherri's mental health and on her mysterious memory loss. He claimed that Sherri had what he referred to as self-defeating personality disorder. This is not recognized as a formal diagnosis in the DSM or in the ICD. It was listed in the DSM-3R, which was published in 1987, as a provisional disorder for further study, but it never made it into the DSM-4 in 1994. The construct was excluded because there was not enough reliable research to validate it as a distinct clinical entity, and it was heavily influenced by psychodynamic theory, which is not empirically supported. The influence of psychodynamic theory can also be seen when Sherri's therapist indicated she had broken through a difficult defense mechanism and would no longer tell big lies. Defense mechanisms are also not empirically supported. Even though self-defeating personality disorder isn't a formal diagnosis, it describes traits which are clinically relevant. For example, internalized shame, history of trauma, learned helplessness, and maladaptive coping strategies. According to her therapist, Sherri had a tendency to enter an unfulfilling relationship and create a second secret life. This is an interesting theory, but it's not consistent with self-defeating personality. The therapist is describing a person who is impulsive, irresponsible, and sensation-seeking, not necessarily an individual with learned helplessness. The therapist talked about how Sherri had received 5 years of treatment with EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. EMDR is a controversial treatment modality which incorporates a component called exposure and response prevention, or ERP. This component, which is found in various versions of cognitive behavior therapy, has been around for many years. It has repeatedly been proven as effective. The other part of EMDR is bilateral stimulation, which is usually side-to-side eye movements, but can also be things like tapping and playing auditory tones. This part of the therapy is not effective. It is nonsense. There is no scientific reason to believe that bilateral stimulation helps clients overcome trauma symptoms. Many research studies have demonstrated this. The popularity of EMDR indicates how some psychotherapists have drifted away from evidence-based practice to sensationalistic and crowd-pleasing pseudoscience. Item number 3. Sherri's therapist suggested that her claim about memory loss was true, arguing that she experienced dissociative amnesia. Here we see another controversial concept. Dissociative amnesia is when a person loses access to memories of a traumatic or stressful nature. According to the research literature, there is no compelling evidence for trauma-specific amnesia. Dissociative amnesia does not exist. Memory loss attributed to this condition can be explained by ordinary forgetting, encoding failure under stress, and deception. The research indicates that traumatic events actually tend to be remembered more vividly, not less. They are remembered in the form of intrusive thoughts, like flashbacks. This claim about Sherri having dissociative amnesia is not surprising coming from her therapist, because many clinicians who use EMDR set the recovery of memories as a therapeutic goal. There is a whole industry built around the nonsensical concept of repressed memory. Item number 4, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Sherri Papini appeared in the documentary in order to stage another hoax. In this one, she would also play the victim. Now, instead of being victimized by two Hispanic women, she is being victimized by her ex-boyfriend. Sherri simply substituted one lie for another. Throughout the documentary, Sherri had the support of several people: her parents, her attorneys, and her therapist. She put forward a desperate attempt to salvage her reputation, claiming that she could not tell the truth in the beginning due to fear and shame, but now she can. There was a kidnapping reenactment in the documentary which featured Sherri. This was her big opportunity to once again manipulate and control people. Now the film crew needed her. Sherri was in the driver's seat, at least temporarily. This reenactment was also a chance for Sherri to show off how distressed she was at reliving the kidnapping. She could prove to the world that she was telling the truth because her emotions could never lie. The attention-seeking tendency that Sherri has repeatedly demonstrated gave that reenactment the gravitational power of a black hole. There was no way that Sherri could escape. She had to participate. At the very end of the documentary, Sherri asked someone off camera, presumably a producer, "Do you think this film will do more harm than good for me?" This is consistent with Sherri's profound lack of insight. Clearly, the documentary hurt her reputation even more. It once again demonstrated her desire to be deceptive. Sherri wanted to convince people that she lied because she was a victim, but she ended up proving beyond any doubt that she could never be trusted. Now moving to my final thoughts. In my opinion, the Sherri Papini documentary was not well made. Several opportunities to challenge Sherri were overlooked, and it promoted unsupported, and in some cases discredited, therapeutic concepts. The film blurred the line between trauma-informed care and trauma-indulgent storytelling. Polygraph nonsense was even thrown into the mix for good measure. Sherri was given exactly what she wanted: an opportunity to grab attention, elicit sympathy, and promote a narrative entirely focused on her. While the documentary did manage to reveal her pattern of deception, it did so in the most inefficient and credulous way possible, offering Sherri yet another platform instead of accountability. Those are my thoughts on the case of Sherri Papini. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Beyond the easy-to-answer question of was Sherri lying? She was. There is another key question. What motivated Sherri to disappear for 22 days? There was financial gain as a result of her deception, but it doesn't seem like that was her motive. Here's what I think happened. Again, this is only my opinion. Sherri was looking for excitement outside her marriage. She was talking to her former boyfriend James using burner phones. Some of these discussions were about sex. Over time, the conversation became more heated, and the types of sex acts described became more extreme. This kind of built up over time. It was like a pressure cooker. Sherri became increasingly excited, as did James, about living these sexual experiences, about fulfilling the fantasy. Eventually, the feelings became so intense, Sherri quickly made plans to take off with James. This was a moment of impulsivity. It was planned, but it wasn't planned far in advance. When James picked Sherri up in Redding, California, Sherri really didn't have much of an idea of what was going to happen next as far as her life with Keith. She was just abandoning that whole part of her existence. She put her phone on the ground along with her earbuds, and she was kind of saying goodbye to whatever she had been doing and inviting this new adventure with James. So they go to Costa Mesa. They stay in his house for a few weeks. There are all types of sexual encounters, including those that result in injury. Eventually, Sherri becomes bored with this journey. She's tired of this. She realizes that it might be a better idea to return to her former life. James drives her back to Northern California, and Sherri makes up this story to conceal the fact that she had an affair. Like, it was pretty embarrassing to explain that she ran off to have sex with a former boyfriend. To Sherri, it made more sense to make up this story about being kidnapped. She was hoping that with this story, everything would just go back to normal. The police were never going to find the two Hispanic women because they didn't exist. So Sherri was just looking to put all this behind her. She continued talking to the police, however, because she liked the attention. Being the victim of a serious crime and being in the national news became kind of appealing. So when they contacted her for the interview that took place on August 13, Sherri went in there looking for more attention. She wanted to keep this going. Initially, she didn't. She wanted to be in her rearview mirror, but by this point, she was enjoying the stardom a little bit. When the agents explained to her that they knew what happened, Sherri was unwilling to back away from her story. This is why she was eventually convicted for making false statements. So I think this was really just essentially a sexual adventure. Like, this whole story was about a woman who was bored and wanted to have unusual sexual activities with somebody different. I don't think she was looking for money or fame initially. I think those two desires came later on. With the documentary, of course, Sherri had another opportunity to be center stage, and she simply could not resist. Appearing in the film met a need for her. It also gave her an opportunity to repeat her story about being a victim, except in this version, she changed who the victimizer was. That was really the only difference. Her story is still extremely difficult to believe. It seems pretty clear that Sherri is lying. This is one of the major themes of the story. Sherri is someone who simply does not value the truth. She will lie to get her way. And her way is typically trying to seek attention. I think that's a major part of her motivation. So she went on this sexual adventure, and now she's looking for attention. Who knows what's next for Sherri, but I hope she doesn't get any more chances to get in front of a documentary film crew.